clerk has advised me that we are ready to proceed in public now, since you voted to go in public. So with that, I have to open the floor because consideration of draft report is not able to be considered while we're in public. So Ms. Gray, Mr. Fragascatos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I want to say that, that the report that we were to be discussing today was a draft report that we were to be looking at, but we can't talk about that because that was going to be in camera. But delaying the work of this committee is unfortunate because we do have timelines, and especially going into a constituency week next week, the committee is not sitting, and so anytime that we're delaying the work that has been set by this committee just delays things. We know that there's only so many weeks before Christmas that we're going to be sitting, and so all of that really does delay things. But on that, just to talk about the schedule of the committee, one of the things that we at the committee were looking at was having ministers come to committee, and for ministers to come and talk about their mandates, but then also it was that was expanded, and so we see now that. With the schedule that's been put forth is that we have less time with the ministers, and this makes it really difficult. So, for example, when a minister only comes for 1 hour, the minister does their statement, which could be 5 to 10 minutes, and then there's questions, which basically means that members from the official opposition would likely only have one, two, maybe three if we're lucky. And so, we have 4 members on this committee, and when ministers only come for an hour, that means that each member of this committee is not able to ask questions of ministers, and which means that they're not being represented. And when you look at the vast portfolio that ministers have, when you look at each of the ministers that report up through this committee, they have vast portfolios, and so to only have a minister here for an hour, it makes it very, very limited. Even if you just pick one issue that their department is dealing with, it makes it almost impossible to really properly ask the minister as well. There's estimates that the ministers would come to speak on, and so. Based on that, it makes it really, really difficult for us to properly question ministers. We also know as well that the minister that's responsible for disability has put off meeting to this committee. So there have been motions that have been put forth, and this is separate from what I'm talking about coming and talking about mandate or main estimates. And we still don't have a commitment from the Minister of Disability to come to this committee. And so I'm not sure, why she hasn't agreed to come to this committee. Some of what we've talked about, and the original motion for the one of them was originally discussed by this committee back in February. So now, we're looking at, 9 months since the minister knew that she had to come to committee, and that hasn't happened as part of that study. Then, in addition to that, we've called the minister to come to talk about her mandate and for main estimates. And I don't believe we have a date for the Minister of Disability as part of that. So there's twice that we're actually waiting for the minister to come to this committee on, and so it's really unfortunate that the ministers aren't making. Or that that this committee isn't agreeing to have the ministers come and answer about their portfolios. We know that there is a huge amount of issues that do flow through this committee. So we've got the minister responsible for employment. When you look at the employment employment numbers, which are on a trajectory that unemployment keeps going up. When you look at, of course, of housing, when you look at, all of the issues around housing, we do have a number of studies that this committee has done on housing. However, we need to hear from the minister as well. Housing infrastructure and communities. Then there's and diversity. Then there's inclusion and persons with disabilities. We've got labor, we've got seniors, families, children and social development, citizen services. I mean, these are vast portfolios. And to have the ministers only come for 1 hour to talk about the mandate and also potentially to talk about to talk about supplementary estimates when we might only get a couple rounds of questions is not acceptable. And so part of the job of this committee is to work on all of these portfolios and to hold the ministers to account. And so we really need to be hearing from these ministers in a more appropriate way. I know even in past times, this committee has really shut down, the other committee members have really shut down where we've even had 2 ministers come at the same time, or even 3 ministers, which even diminishes that even more. So, there's a lot of questions that we need to ask. We hear from our constituents in our communities. We hear from stakeholders that flow through all of these departments, and we have a lot of questions to answer. Sometimes we'll write a minister's office, and it might take, depending on the minister, anywhere. I've had it take as long as 6 to 9 months that a minister's office might respond to something. So. That's the role of the official opposition, and that's the role of the opposition is to question ministers so that they can justify the decisions that they're making and answer the tough questions. And when we don't have, the ministers coming to really spend the time here that they're needed, it does make it a lot more difficult for us to do our jobs within our portfolios. Because we're meeting with constituents and also stakeholders, and they're asking us, well, are you pressing the minister on this? Are you asking the minister about that? Because quite often they're in the weeds on, the issues that are important to their stakeholders, whether they're a membership-based organization or maybe they're an organization that, that really focuses on certain things that they're advocating for. For example, with persons with disabilities, a lot of those organizations. And so, they'll say, this is what's important to us, and we want to, are you asking about this? But it makes it really difficult when we don't have the ministers here often, and when we don't have them here for much time. There's only so many questions and so many topics that we can ask them about. And so that's why it's really important to have the ministers here longer and to have them here to answer questions that all members are able to ask. And as I said, during a 1 hour time period, we might only get 2 rounds, which means if we have 2 members, then that's only 2 members asking questions. So this does make it very, very difficult for us to hold the government to account and to ask the questions that we need to. We also, might have different issues that we're bringing forth with different recommendations or different suggestions that we can also discuss during those times. And without having the ministers here for a very long period of time, it makes it, again, that makes it much more difficult for us. So, again, as we're looking at our calendar, as we're looking at the schedule from now till Christmas, I know that we do have some other studies that we're completing. I see on the calendar that the committee has invited back the other witness from the CNIB that wasn't able to participate due to translation issues. And ironically, that was on a study that had to do with disabilities and persons with disabilities. And so as a reminder, as we're looking at the calendar, it was Conservatives that had put forth a motion to extend that committee and not close it, so that we could hear from the minister responsible for disabilities, disability inclusion, because she did not come to the other meetings that were scheduled. So we asked for the meeting to be kept open and extended so that we could hear from the minister responsible for disabilities and hear from that stakeholder that wasn't able to participate. And so it's good to see that that's on the calendar now, but that was because Conservatives had pushed for that. And looking at the translation issue, it was incredibly ironic that was a study that that had to do with hearing from persons with disabilities or those that serve or advocate for them, and here we had someone that wasn't able to participate. And I know that was part of House administration rules, and the committee has put forth questioning about that, but that is also on our calendar. So because the minister didn't come and because of that issue, that has taken another day, which from committee, which is good, because we do need to hear from the minister and from that other witness that wasn't able to participate. However, there's also other things that we're waiting for at this committee, and to hear from ministers for all of their portfolio.
Point of order. Yeah, it's not easy to have this in my ear while somebody's talking in the room. And there's a lot of chatter in the room, which makes it then difficult for me to follow what's going on. So, Chair, I just ask if you could please ensure that the room is in a quiet volume, just so it makes it easier for
Ms.
us that
Falk.
are...
Yep, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You are all adults and know the rules. So Ms. Falk has a valid point. Please keep the side conversation to a minimum. Ms. Gray?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just for any of those listening, what is happening is on occasion, here's another translation issue actually, is on occasion what will happen at these committees is where we'll get a feedback. We'll get a feedback in the earpieces, and so you're actually hearing people talk at the same time. So it's like a double, it's sort of like an echo. And so this is an ongoing problem that we've had. I know that the chair has and the clerk have gone back to House administration on this, but it is an ongoing issue, and sometimes it's not a matter of actual translation. It's a matter of just hearing, because the volume in the room isn't very high, and you actually need to have the earpiece in order to be able to hear what's being said. And some of it does appear to be depending on what room we're in and depending on the setup of the translators. So it is an ongoing problem. We have commented on it many times, and for some reason we seem to be having the issue here again today. I don't know if this is the room. They also had to turn off a monitor due to sound issues that we've had in this room before. So this is an ongoing issue. But back to what I was discussing with relation to the business of committee and with relation to ministers coming to committee. It's even when we look back, I think it was a year ago, the ministers were to come on estimates, and it was past the date when they were to come, and they were pushed off. And so there's certain deadlines that this committee has to follow, and that all committees have to follow. And the ministers actually were coming well into the new year, which does make it more difficult. So when we're looking at the issues that the ministers have to come here and discuss, it's really important. And we want to be questioning ministers on their entire portfolio. Especially sometimes we'll hear ministers make comments and we're not sure where it's coming from. One of the ministers was.
On the other side, can you just ask just to keep it a little bit low? I can't hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coteau. I've already
Was
raised
there a point of
that.
order? I didn't hear point of order.
Yeah, that's already been raised.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I'll comment too that if people have multiple people have their mics on, then you do get feedback as well. So just some people on the other side there. So, so again, for asking ministers questions, we've heard ministers or parliamentary secretaries make comments in the House of Commons that, you're sort of questioning where does that come from, and the opportunity to ask them would be at this committee when they come to committee. There was a minister just last week that had made a comment about Canada summer jobs, and I was sort of looking at her thinking, where does that come from? That is not something that came through this committee. It's not a recommendation that came through the Canada Summer Job Study that we had. It's not, it's not something that was brought forth in the Conservative dissenting report when we did the study on Canada Summer Jobs. So those are the kind of things that when we do have the ministers here, we can question them. Well, where is that coming from? Is that, where are you hearing that? Is that a new policy? And so that's why it's really important for us to have ministers here and have them here for a good length of time to talk about their mandates, and then also to talk about their the main estimates. There are a number of ministers that we have not had here at this committee to even talk about their mandates. And we know with the cabinet shuffle that happened several months ago, we have not had those ministers here to talk about their mandates. So there are new ministers in those portfolios. A number of them, their mandates didn't necessarily change from the former appointments. However, it behooves us to have those ministers come here so that they can tell us what their, where their priorities are and how they fit into what those mandates are. We haven't even had an opportunity to do that with that cabinet shuffle that happened a number of months ago. There might be another cabinet shuffle that might be happening with some ministers that are potentially stepping, where they might move things around because there's some people that have announced that on the Liberal side that they're no longer running in the next election. So there might be another shift as well. And if that does happen, and if it does involve this committee at all, we should be allowed to, have those potentially new appointed ministers come here to talk about their mandate and where their focus is. And so that's why it's so important as part of the work that we do at this committee to be really questioning the ministers. We know, I know even just for myself, meeting with a number of stakeholders within all of these parts that fall within my role, specifically as Shadow Minister for Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion. I'm meeting with a lot of different stakeholders, and they're bringing a lot of issues forth to me. And I really need the opportunity to be questioning the ministers on that, and specifically the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Official Languages, and then also the Minister for, that includes persons with disabilities. So, and we haven't had those ministers here for quite a while. And so it's really important that when we do have them here, that we've got them for a good length of time, so that all members on the official opposition side do have an opportunity to really question them, because they're all representing, regardless of their shadow portfolios, they're also representing their constituents, and their constituents ask them, we want to, the next time that you see the minister, can you ask these questions? We all get asked that. And if we're not given the opportunity, then it makes it more difficult for our jobs. Our jobs are to bring the voices of our communities here to Ottawa. And one of the ways to do that is through committee work, and to ask ministers the important questions that we're hearing from our residents. And then also, if we're a shadow minister, within our portfolio. So that's why it's so important to have ministers here for a good length of time. 1 hour is simply not enough to cover everything that we have to, which includes mandates, main estimates, any other issues that we might that we might want to ask. And sometimes too, the ministers will bring their officials, and then they might, turn to the official to answer questions, and that even takes more time. The ministers should be expected generally to come in the fall, because that's when main estimates are. We've also asked the ministers to come to talk about their mandates. And so, when we look at our calendar going from now till Christmas, we just know for many of the ministers that they'll be here for just an hour, but we don't know when. They haven't committed. And so it's really not a surprise that a minister should be coming to committee in the fall. And it shouldn't be a surprise that they should be, expecting to answer questions. And yet we don't know when many of the ministers are coming here. And, the committee has just, the committee has the authority to have ministers come for longer. Ministers only coming for an hour to cover off on all of the things that we need to cover off is really not long enough. And so that's why we need to have them here, whether it's longer or we need to have them come back, because there's just not enough time to ask the ministers everything that we need to ask them. And I know even, again, going back to my shadow portfolio, I'm meeting continually with stakeholders within that, both from across the country. Many people that are in person here in Ottawa when they come and have their Hill days. Many people I'll meet on Zooms, and in order to get the feedback from them, and they'll say, well, how are you advancing this? What are you doing? And of course, we can recommend studies at committee. We can put forth motions at committee to call different people here. We've done that before, for example, when we called the CEO of Air Canada here to talk about the issues relating to persons with disabilities. And we can question ministers when they come here to talk about their mandates or main estimates. And so, that's really what our job is, but it makes it more difficult when many ministers might only come once a year. I can think of a couple of ministers that we haven't seen at this committee for a year now. And there's always emerging issues that happen. Quite often we'll add in with a number of motions where, we'll add in that ministers also appear, and quite often that isn't agreed to. So therefore it makes it more difficult, because then really the only time that we can question ministers is when they come for main estimates or when they come for mandates.
Quickly.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I'm just hoping maybe through you to MP Gray, you could refresh us as to what topic, or with respect, MP Gray's kind of all over different topics. So I guess my question is, could we, through you, ask MP Gray to maybe come forth with the motion?
There is no specific topic when we went in public. And Ms. Gray, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Right, because we don't have an agenda for this time here, so we don't have an agenda, but here we are in camera. So so therefore, when we came out of camera to go into public, so based on that, most of what I've been talking about is ministers coming to committee, and the other thing that we should really consider at this committee as well is, when we do have ministers coming here, when we do have stakeholders coming here, it's really important for us to be able to question and ask them. Now, one of the things with this committee that is a challenge is, it's a challenge from a time perspective, is that we do have a fair amount of legislation that comes through this committee. And so that really does that really does sometimes delay our ability to do a number of different studies. Legislation is important, and of course, government legislation is first, and then private members' bills as well. And there always seems to be a number of private members' bills that do come through this committee, specifically around EI. Seems to be a topic that from all parties where there's different private members' bills that come through. I knew my colleague here, Rosemary Falk, had a great private members' bill that had to do with yes, and it was really it was so good that in fact the Liberal government took the private members' bill idea and put it in their ombudsman bill, I believe, in the fall economic statement. That particular, I'm glad to hear from members opposite that she did a good job in it. I do agree. And just to refresh our memory, that had to do with people who were adopting or were surrogate. There's another word for intended parents. Yes, intended parents. And that was a great piece of legislation to had parity for the amount of time that people would go on EI. And as opposed to people who had birthed a child. And it was a great piece of legislation. I was really proud to actually second that piece of legislation and to speak on it. And also as a person who is adopted myself, it actually meant a lot to me. So thank you very much. It's that type of legislation that is really great that our members can put forth. And I was really happy to see that did go through all stages, although it then got stuck because the government did not give it royal assent, unfortunately. And then they put it in with their own legislation. I guess they wanted to have credit for it. So, but you're the one that deserves the credit, Ms. Falk. Absolutely. And it was very impactful to hear from many of the stakeholders from across the country that supported your legislation. I know that we've got other pieces of legislation that have come through here as well. Private members' bills that have been really well thought out. I know that we have our colleague Ms. Vienne from Quebec that has a great piece of legislation that will be coming to this committee. I know that it was supported. I believe it was supported unanimously in the House. Maybe. I think it was. I'd have to look back, and that was another great conservative piece of legislation. That's another really good piece of legislation that will be coming to this committee soon. It will take a priority over other things because it is a private member's bill, and we also know that for private members' bills that there are timelines that have to be met, or else you have to ask for extensions. So it's really, that's really important. Some of these pieces of legislation or some of these recommendations really do come from wanting to support families, but also we know that families are having an incredibly difficult time. We know that food bank usage is higher than it ever has been before. We've heard incredible amounts of testimony at this committee on that particular topic. I know that in particular when we were doing a study that was on intergenerational volunteerism, we heard from a number of not-for-profit organizations that gave very impactful testimony how their not-for-profits were really suffering because their donations were down. They were losing volunteers because they were saying that there was a number of clients of theirs that then had to become clients, unfortunately. We heard from some not-for-profits where they had lost volunteers that were seniors because they had to go back to work. They had to go back to work in order to pay for their basic necessities. We heard the record numbers of food bank usage. I know that we had one of the witnesses that was actually from my community, from the Central Okanagan Food Bank, that really talked about the increases in numbers. And I know for myself, I've talked about this quite a bit, that I've seen this too with other members of this committee, where we want to represent our residents, and I always made it a goal coming here that I wanted to bring the voice of my community to Ottawa, and made it really a point to bring forth witnesses that could testify on a whole number of different topics. There's a lot of witnesses that have testified here that have, might have worked in an industry for 30 years and never testified at a parliamentary committee before. So it was really impactful for them to bring their voice forth here. And I'm always thinking of who might fit with this study, but might be an expert in their own way, and bring their voice here. And if not within my committee, then from British Columbia, because I think sometimes here you've got the Ottawa bubble, as they call it, where you're hearing from a lot of the same witnesses. And so I think it's important to hear from witnesses from all across the country.
Madame Chabot.
Mr. Chairman, a point of order.
Mr.
Mr. Chairman, I'm calling on you because there are many people listening to us, because no doubt we're a very popular committee. They must be wondering what it is we're doing. We had an agenda because we had an in-camera session, and a member of the government asked us to go public, and we don't yet know with what objective in mind that was. As part of the procedure, and I address this comment to you, Mr. Chair, because I'm not familiar enough with the procedure, is it possible to table a motion to go back into the in-camera session as planned, and then to follow our agenda as was planned?
There was, again, an issue.
On that point of order.
No, Ms. Gray, if it's on a point of order. Ms. Gray?
Ms. Falk.
Sorry.
That's okay. I'm having a hard time
Yeah.
hearing Ms. Chabot. I'm hearing her French, on the English channel, which has the interpreter English on the same channel. And I'm having a very hard time hearing what she's saying.
The issue, what the technical people telling me, is the volume. So.
If I turn my volume up, I'm hearing her French in the room and on the channel with the English. I'm hearing it all on one. And if I turn it down, I hear nothing except what's in the room. And it's unacceptable as a member of parliament for me to be contributing to committee and not being able to hear the language that my colleague wants to speak in.
Thank you, Ms.
Unacceptable.
Falk. I do not approve the language validations and the technical aspects. The technical people do, and they meet the standards set by the House of Commons.
I'm sorry, Chair, that is unacceptable. If I can't hear a colleague of mine who is speaking in another language, how can we participate equally in the committee? It's not acceptable. It's impeding on our ability to actually participate and be heard in the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Falk. There could be some differences. I was able to hear the translation with no problem. No, I have Ms. Falk. Sorry, I have Mr. Seebeck, and then I'll go to Mr. Coteau on a point of order.
On that point of order. Yeah, so there was an agenda for an in-camera meeting to discuss several things. There was a motion to move out of camera and change the agenda, and Mademoiselle Chabot voted in favor of that. So I'm not sure why she's so confused as to where we are. She decided to disrupt the agenda and vote with the Liberal motion.
Monsieur le Président.
This is where we are today. I'm not finished.
Un appel au règlement de me faire qualifier de confuse.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Order, committee members. I'm going to Mr. Cateau, keep it narrow on the committee voted to move in public. Ms. Gray has the floor, and she has the floor.
Point of order, yeah.
Yes.
So, so just a quick question, Mr. Chair, in regards to relevance. What's in front of us right now as a committee?
There was no specific item attached to the motion. to
So
move
wouldn't
in
it be
public.
correct to assume that if nothing is in front of us, then nothing is relevant, therefore we should probably move to some type of motion or something, like we have to place something in front of us? We're just talking about nothing. Well, in order to move something or to do something.
Ms. Gray has the floor, and the committee is scheduled for 2 hours. Mr. Fragas-Catos?
Point of order, Chair. Look, there's differences between parties on a range of issues. My experience has always been that we've engaged each other with respect, with decorum. Mr. Seebeck's comments about Ms. Chabot, really out of line, he should apologize for saying something like that. That questioning the whether or not a member understands what she's doing, or that's just not collegiate.
Thank you, Mr. Fragas-Catos. We're now going to return to Ms. Gray, and Ms. Gray has the floor.
Thank you.
Before I get the point of orders, I will be really clear on being relevant. Ms. Gray.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hang on, I just have to turn down because now I'm hearing myself twice here. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here we are at this committee, which is the Human Resources Committee, and we really do deal with a lot of compassionate type issues at this committee. We've heard some pretty impactful testimony how people are struggling. We know that recently there was the Food Banks Canada Hunger Report, which was the 2024 Hunger Report, which had stated that there was a historic over 2 million, I think it was 2,059,636 visits in March of 2024 of this year alone. And we know that life has become more expensive for Canadians after 9 years of this government. And Food Banks Canada released the data showing that record number of Canadians are struggling just to keep their head above water, having to rely on food banks. According to their hunger count, food banks recorded these historic numbers, which is an increase of 6% from the previous year. And it was a shocking 90% increase from 2019. We know that over a quarter of those visits were made by children, which is really heartbreaking. And as a result of these historic levels of demand placed on food banks, nearly 30% of food banks across the country, across their network, reported running out of food in the last 12 months. And I'm not sure if anyone has seen some of the headlines very recently, even over the last couple of weeks, about food banks really coming out reporting on this. There's many food banks that are concerned with being able to fulfill their holiday commitments, their Christmas commitments. Another 56% reported giving out less food to avoid running out before they could serve anyone. And in 2021, these numbers were 10% and 20% respectively. So we can see the huge increase here. Something that a lot of people don't talk about is with inflation, and we know that food inflation was higher than inflation itself. Once you break it down, that the numbers don't go back down. So when you had food inflation that was over 8%, 9%, 11% there, if inflation itself, comes down below 2%, it's still at that higher amount, which is why people are having such a tough time. When inflation goes down to, say, below 2%, that doesn't mean that it goes down to what it was back in 2018. It's still at that higher amount, which is why we're seeing so many families really struggling. We know that Food Banks Canada also reported that up to 25% of Canadians are living in a state of poverty, while 35% of Canadians feel worse off financially. Among those who reported experiencing a worsening financial situation compared to 3 months ago, 40% cited the rising cost of food as the primary reason, and 30% of Canadians are worried about not being able to feed themselves and their families. So, we know that the carbon tax does add to the cost of food. We know that it adds to the cost of transportation.
Ms. Gray, we have a point of order from Mr. Fragos-Catos.
It's not my intention to interrupt, of course, but Ms. Gray began her talk here today about ministerial appearances. She does have a motion on notice on that very subject. If she wanted to put that motion forward, I think we would welcome that, certainly on our side. We would be ready to vote. That would be staying on topic. She's now deviating to another topic, but I leave that with her to decide. That motion is something we're ready to look at.
Mr. Fragos-Catos, Ms. Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there isn't a topic. So because we don't have an agenda for an out of camera portion here, but thank you for your consideration. We know that Stats Canada released new numbers showing that for the 8th time in 9 quarters, Canada's GDP per capita had dropped. And why is GDP per capita important? What the government talks about a lot is GDP. And yet GDP per capita is actually relative to the productivity of a country. It also is relative to how people are doing in their households. And we know that the GDP per capita of Canada has gone down over the last 9 years. We know that Canada's productivity has gone down. And the OECD actually has Canada on track to be one of the least productive countries over the next many, many years, unless there is a substantive change in fiscal and economic policy made by the government. The GDP per capita for Canada has now fallen more than any other G7 country since the year before COVID. And this is the direct result of higher taxes on everything from capital gains, on energy, on work, higher taxes on everything. And also we have the debt has grown more during this 9 years of this government than at any other time accumulated from all of the previous governments in Canada. The gap between U.S. and Canadian incomes is now worse than at any time in the last century, as the average American now earns $20,000 more than the average Canadian. This is a substantial difference. We had testimony here recently from one of the witnesses on the housing study that had talked about when we were asking about losing business here in Canada, going to the U.S., and why it was more, why we're losing Canadian businesses to the U.S. And he had referred to the fact that that is true, but also losing workers. And because of the opportunity, but also just even because of the cost of living is less. I think the one witness referred to his son potentially even looking at that. So this is real. This is real when we're losing opportunity in Canada and when businesses are looking to the U.S. Well, look, we even had recently with Mark Carney's company saying that they're going to be moving their head, Brookfield, that they're going to be moving to the U.S. out of Canada, which is absolutely interesting considering that Mr. Carney is one of the top advisors to the Prime Minister on economic I think he's called his top economic advisor, and yet he's moving that company to the U.S. That was just announced. That's really quite interesting. We know that when we look at the GDP per capita, that this means lower wages in comparison to the U.S., which means Canadians can afford less and less that they can spend on food, housing, basic necessities. And we also know governments can afford less for schools and hospitals, and these are the direct results of that. We know that Canada is falling behind other countries because of weak business investment, a lack of competition, and a failure to really look at the workforce and to lower taxes. And this lower GDP per capita is a made in Canada issue. We can't blame, the current government quite often will blame so much on everyone else, including, global factors, and there is some of that, but really when you look at GDP per capita, when you look at tax increases, there is so much that we can look at that is a direct result of policies of this current government. A lot of these issues are made in Canada issues. We know that there's been investment that has been driven out of the country for everything. When we look at housing being so much less in the United States, we know that fuel costs less. The United States doesn't charge a carbon tax on the fuel that their citizens use. And really, Canadians deserve better, and we're really falling behind other countries, in particular the U.S. We know as well that when we look at EI, for example, on unemployment insurance, and we know that EI does come through this committee as well, which is why it would be really important to have the minister come here for longer than an hour. His portfolio covers so much that we need to ask him about. In August, just under 500,000 Canadians were claiming unemployment insurance, and that was the fourth consecutive monthly increase, and an increase of 26,000 people from the same time last year. As a result of this, Canada reached a 20-month high in the number of people that were claiming EI. We also know as part of this that the largest group of people that are collecting EI are young adults, and so we can see why young adults are struggling and having mental health issues and are losing hope with ever being able to afford a home or being able to have a good lifestyle. It's incredibly sad, which is why you're seeing so many young adults that are coming out en masse not in favor of the policies of this government. We know that in September, the labor force survey, which showed that year over year, employment had only increased by 313,000 people, while the working age population surged by 1.2 million, leaving an enormous employment deficit. And since January of 2023, Canada's unemployment rate has followed a downward trend, falling by a full percentage point. We also know that Canada's GDP per capita is currently on track to decrease again. So, unless there's some substantive economic and fiscal policy changes made by this government, all of the trajectories aren't looking positive, in particular for our young adults. It was expected that food will cost. Is this a point of order?
Chair, there was a pause there. I take that Ms. Gray is relinquishing the floor, or at least if she's not, then a pause would indicate
Me breathing?
that we're ready to. No, it's not even about that.
Oh.
Chair, I'm next
That's
on
not
the
a
list.
point of order.
I'm next on the list, and there was a break in what she was saying. It's time to
I didn't cede my time.
relinquish the floor.
Thank you. I will remind members that, yes, you have the floor until you stop speaking. If you stop speaking, I will make a call. and move to the next person on the
Thank you,
list.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Gray?
Thank you, Mr.
But
Chair.
if there's
I
a
hope that you
pause,
allow
I
my, if I take a breath or, swallow,
Chair.
that maybe that is not.
I'll be the judge of
Yeah.
stopping and moving to the next speaker. Thank you. Ms. Gray, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a little, yeah. So after 9 years, we know that food costs families $700 more this year than it did in 2023. And millions of Canadians are having to line up outside of food banks just to survive. We've now seen record numbers of people going to food banks, 2 million people a month going to food banks. We've heard, as I mentioned earlier, food banks are running out of food. And making different policies around who they're going to serve. We also heard Statistics Canada report on food insecurity, where it showed that nearly 15.6% of Canadians experienced food insecurity in 2022, which was up from 11.6% in 2018. Excuse me. And 9.6% in 2017. This means that the rate of food insecure Canadians had increased by over 60% over the course of just 2 years. These are numbers from Statistics Canada. This isn't any kind of partisanship discussion. These are actually Stats Canada. These are actually Stats Canada numbers. It became worse in 2024. Which made it clear through Food Banks Canada in their 2024 poverty report card, showing that almost 50% of Canadians feel financially worse off compared to last year, while 25% of Canadians are experiencing food insecurity. And of course, food insecurity means that people are able to have the food that they need in order to survive. We've also heard stories, sad stories, that scurvy is taking an increase in Canada. Again, it's just absolutely unbelievable. Across the country, food banks have seen a 50% increase in visits since 2021. And this is a direct consequence of the NDP Liberal government's inflationary tax and spending agenda and their carbon tax. We know that the carbon tax makes the price of everything go up. Everything that is transported has the carbon tax tied to it. So when you're talking about the farmer who grows the food, you're talking about maybe the food manufacturer, if that's the case, the warehousers, transporters, retailers, and then ultimately the consumers. And so all along the way, there's carbon tax that's being charged at every stage as you go. And so no wonder food prices have increased as much as they have. And you only have to go to a grocery store and able to see the increases in the food prices. We know that the carbon tax is slated to increase to 61 cents a litre. And that will be on every point of this value chain, every point of this food chain, if you call it that, as you go. And so that will only increase prices more. So even as you see, where inflation might be, we're looking at food costs will go up, and ultimately those get passed on onto the consumer. That gets passed on to families. And when you're looking at this as well, even those that are supporting families, like food banks, that means that their costs go up as well. So people do donate money. Not everyone donates, food and cans. The food banks really rely on, and other organizations really rely on fiscal financial donations, and they're not going as far. We hear that quite often. So as costs keep increasing, their costs keep increasing. And so it just makes it's a really vicious cycle. And there are things that we need to do in order to, I just took a sip of water. Hopefully that didn't, sorry, hopefully that's allowed. Thank you very much. And, another issue that we can look at is is when we're looking at at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation releasing their housing data for September, which was just a month ago, showing that that there's still not enough homes being built for Canada's population, and as a result, housing affordability will continue to remain out of reach for Canadians. This CMHC report, which again, this isn't a partisan report, this comes right from the government. It shows that housing starts continue to trend lower, while Canada's population it has increased. And in fact, the 6-month trend reveals a 1.9% decrease from 246,972 units in August to 243,759 units in September. And when comparing September 2024 to September 2023, the results are even actually worse. So across the country, housing starts were down 15% to 18,806 this September, compared to 22,194 in September of 2023. In Nova Scotia, housing starts collapsed by 40% in the same period, while Ontario saw a drop of 37%. Those numbers are staggering. And you know, we know that there has to be a lot more housing starts happen in order to build the homes that we need, but also to bring back some type of affordability. And I'll talk more about the Conservative announcement shortly. Similarly, in Canada's most expensive cities, the government's housing plans and their policies have really not done anything to build more homes. For example, in Toronto, when comparing September 2024 to September 2023, the number of housing starts declined by 64%, while Montreal and Halifax saw their housing starts decline by 59% and 61% respectively. Those are huge numbers. Those are huge numbers that are show that starts are actually down. We also know some of this. We've had different testimony come here from witnesses that have talked about that are builders, that are experts in their field, that have talked about the interest rates, you know, being one of the main reasons. We know that that interest rates are, you know, slowly coming down, but they're still very high.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I just realized it's getting very noisy in here again, and I'm sitting very close to Ms. Gray, and I was struggling to hear it, and she's talking about something very important, housing, so I really want to hear it. I just want to make sure I could.
Thank you, Mr. Aitchison. As I indicated before, I hear the noise coming from all around the room, and I'll remind you, you are all adults, Ms. Gray.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, as well as we're looking at this, so I was talking about us having some of the construction companies that were here and builders that were here that talked about that we're talking about how it's more difficult because the interest rates are high. Costs have gone up, and they've talked about, you know, just the cost of everything, cost of transportation, which we know is increasing because of the carbon taxes adding to the cost of their transportation. And then in addition to that, we've had witnesses that have talked about how the capital gains tax is not helping as well, because you get investors that might invest in a large number of these larger development projects, which we need. And so the capital gains tax change is actually not going to help housing. I had actually asked recently a number of witnesses on where the finance minister had said when she announced originally the capital gains tax that it would help with housing and increase housing, and we heard that. That's not the case. I asked multiple witnesses about that, and they said, "Well, no, it's not. It's not going to." So so there's a number of factors that are actually not helping with that are federal policy related that are not helping with the building of homes, and we know that there needs to be 5.8 million homes built. The CMHC has said that Canada needs to build those homes by 2030 in order to restore housing affordability. And again, at a number of these different witnesses that were at committee here, myself and others, had asked whether or not we're going to be on track to do that. And even if you break it down by how many houses you have to build per year, are we on track to do that? And there, right all along the way, we heard no, that we are not on track to do that. Like there's no, I think one witness actually said, not a chance. His answer was not a chance. And so we know based on these policies that we are not on track to build those number of homes, which is why we need really bold policies, which, for example, the leader of the official opposition this week had announced a conservative policy to, that when he becomes prime minister and when the Conservatives are in government, that we would remove the GST on all new homes sold up to $1 million, which, as an example, for an $800,000 home, that would mean a savings of $40,000 or $2,200 a year in mortgage payments. This is substantial. This is a substantial policy that we put out, and it has been overwhelming with the number of organizations that have come out in favor of that particular policy to in order to build homes and also to bring back affordability, especially for young families and people starting out owning a home for the first time. I don't have the list in front of me here, but just a couple of them. There was the Canadian Home Builders Association, Canadian Real Estate Council Organization. There was the Habitat for Humanity. There have been policy experts that have come out on that. West End Home Builders Association. A number of organizations from all across the country. And whether they're national organizations or local organizations that have come out saying that they were in favor of this. And just to read a couple of quotes of how impactful this will be. The Canadian Home Builders Association said, "Today's announcement by the Conservative Party of Canada to remove GST on new homes with the purchase price under $1 million will make a big difference if enacted, especially for first-time buyers," unquote. West End Home Builders Association CEO Mike Collins-Williams said, "Removing the GST for new homes purchased for under $1 million may be the most significant housing policy commitment made in the last 2 decades. Removing the GST shows leadership to cut crippling levels of taxation on new housing, puts money directly back into the pockets of Canadians while combating the housing crisis," unquote. We have the Coalition Against New Homes Taxes, who said, "This policy marks a significant first step in addressing Canada's housing affordability crisis, a goal we believe is essential for substantial economic growth and accessible housing for Canadians." There's also the Canadian Real Estate Association, which said, "This proposed step is a positive move toward lowering building costs, increasing housing supply, and making home ownership more attainable for Canadians." The Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness founder and CEO Tim Richter said, "This is smart." Habitat for Humanity said, "Under the current framework, Habitat affiliates are paying more in GST to the federal government than is received through co-investment funding. Eliminating GST would reduce cost. Savings are passed on to Habitat homeowners." The Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association said, "In Ottawa, this change would mean that townhomes, which make up to up over 50% of new home sales would be eligible for the full rebate, instantly making a significant improvement in housing affordability across the National Capital Region. And Build GTA said, Build applauds the federal Conservatives' announcement on their commitment to addressing one of our calls to action. If elected, they plan to remove the federal portion of the HST on new homes under $1 million. This is a significant step forward in helping housing affordability. There's also the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. President of the, this is Richard Lyle. We commend opposition leader Pierre Poilievre and his party for putting forward this plan to remove the GST and encourage the provinces to do the same, as it will save buyers tens of thousands of dollars on the purchase of a new home. And then we've got Leona, Director of Public Relations, Victoria Mancinelli. This is a good policy. We've also got Eric Lombardi, which is a Toronto-based consultant with expertise in financial services, who said, glad to see this, much needed change. I'd also suggest indexing to inflation. I also echo the call for provinces to end the HST on home ownership dreams. DCs slash LTTs. However, funding shouldn't come at the expense of the housing fund. Now, what I do want to mention here actually is calling on the removal of the provincial taxes as well, which the leader of the opposition did do yesterday, which was to call for provinces where it's appropriate to also remove the provincial sales taxes. And so this is very important. We've also had Mike Moffat, economist and founding director to Place Center, which said, wow, according to my costing calculator, this is about 5 to 6 billion tax cut on new housing each year. I admire the boldness here. This will get more housing built. I also know that Dr. Moffat has also given a number of other comments online as well on X that related to this announcement. He's had quite a number of comments. I don't have them on all here, but I do encourage anyone to that is on X to go and have a look at those comments, because they really are quite substantial. We've also got Martin Pelletier, economy columnist at the National Post, who said, now, that's a good idea. We have Steve Saretsky, real estate, which said no GST on new homes under $1 million. That will certainly make new construction prices more competitive when competing against the resale market. And there's more coming in all the time. So that's just a small example of some of the comments made by some of these experts in home building and policy.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm just wondering where I am on the speaking list. I just.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
So it's Miss Gray, Mr. Fragiscatos, then myself. Is there anyone else on the speaking list?
And Ms. Falk and Mr. Aitchison.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
The topic is I do not choose that. Ms. Gray has the floor.
No, but I mean, can you tell us what the topic is in front of us as the chair?
The topic is the points that Ms. Gray is discussing. Thank you. Ms. Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The other thing that I'll mention is sort of on this point is how rent continues to get more expensive for Canadians. We know that rentals.ca published their national rent report, which showed the consequences of this government's policies. Canada's average asking rent reached a record high of $2,093 in September. And on top of this, the cost of rent is 13.4% higher than it was 2 years ago, and 25.2% higher than it was 3 years ago. So this means that the cost of rent has really massively outpaced Canadians' paychecks. We know the situation is even considerably more difficult in Canada's largest cities. So, for example, in Vancouver, British Columbia, the average asking rent for all unit types reached $3,023, while Canadians are having to pay $2,668 in Toronto. And so with rent costing as much as it does, many Canadians are having to live in shared accommodation. We know that many, in particular young adults, are still living with parents. I know that there are many, I know myself of many, some constituents of mine where a family has had to move back in with one of the parents just in order to get by, so that maybe they can work on saving for a home one day. And on that topic, we know that it used to take 25 years to save for a down payment, and now, I got that backwards. Let me rephrase that. It used to take 25 years to pay off a mortgage, and now it takes 25 years to save for a down payment. And I remember being in, my early 20s, like many of us in this room here, where, as long as you had a decent job, you could have a decent car, you could go on the odd holiday, and you could save up, within a short amount of time on a down payment for your first, small place to start out. Though that doesn't exist anymore, which is why you're seeing so many young adults still living with relatives, family members, families living together, because they just can't afford to either live on their own or can't afford to be saving up for their first place. And so this is the reality that people are in. We also know as well, in talking with seniors, that, in order for them to even consider downsizing, I talk to seniors quite often in my riding, who, they're saying, well, I could sell my home, but, where do I go? Because prices are so high now. Even if I downsize, everything is so expensive. So it's affecting everyone in all demographics, this cost of housing. We know that, housing costs have doubled in 9 years. Those are substantial numbers. We know that, the Canada Mortgaging and Housing Corporation has made it clear that the number of homes being built isn't enough to reduce the existing supply gap and improve affordability for Canadians. We also have heard as well, actually, on that, when we're talking about affordability and housing through CMHC, we had a number of people testify here at some recent housing studies where they were saying that the bureaucracy and red tape and costs that CMHC is actually imposing themselves are making housing less affordable. So as an example, we heard from more than one not-for-profit who was talking about the fact that CMHC will impose extra ways of building that are above the sort of regular, if you want to call it that, building code standards, that therefore are adding costs. They will also impose that you need different experts to come in, to look at, even though it meets all the building codes and you might even get a building permit, that you have to have these extra consultants come in. And we heard testimony from some of these not-for-profits that, that could easily add at least $15,000 per unit. So this is a huge amount. They had also expressed how with CMHC that that the delays that they're experiencing when they do these applications with CMHC actually can add to costs. And we heard testimony from one witness that was saying, well, if depending on, where the building is, if you don't have approvals, you might miss the whole season because of the weather, and so you may not be able to start or move along whatever stage it is. And so we heard that actual policies from CMHC are actually impeding building these affordable units and actually adding to costs. Also, going back to some of these consultants that have to come in, we did hear that in particular in rural communities, that they may not have these consultants readily available. So then you're having to bring them in from a major municipality, and again, that adds delays and costs. So in fact, some of the policies of this government and through CMHC are actually not helping build affordable homes due to the bureaucracy and the red tape and the additional costs. We also know that as well at the same time that Canadians' paychecks are just not keeping up with inflation. We had a report recently through the Parliamentary Budget Officer that showed that inflation and sky-high interest rates had eroded the power of Canadians' paychecks over the last 2 years. And this is especially hard on low-income workers. While the wealthiest of Canadians saw their wealth appreciate thanks to their investment income. And I don't have it here, but I was actually just reading an article last night. I think it might be in the Financial Post, but I was just reading something last night that was talking about this, where again, that during this time and even in recent time, the people that are getting the furthest ahead are the wealthiest of the wealthiest, because they've seen their investments go up. And if you're not at that level, the middle class, or as we call the working class, the working poor, have really been a lot of the hardest hit. Going back to this Parliamentary Budget Officer report, in it, it was described inflation and the accompanying tightening of monetary policy have affected household purchasing power disproportionately, depending on income level, unquote. And on top of this, Canadians' incomes have not kept up with Trudeau's rampant inflation. In fact, RBC predicted last month, or recently, so this would have been in September, that Canada's GDP per capita will decrease for the 6th consecutive quarter. And this means that the in-person income of Canadians has now fallen back to the same level that we've seen previously, while unemployment has increased. And we also know that even government's own reports themselves have said that they're expecting unemployment to on a trajectory to continue to rise. We know that Canadians have seen price increases of more than 15% on a typical basket of goods and services. And the cost of food, shelter, and transportation have grown especially quickly, which again has made it really tough for those in the lower income percentiles and a lot of the working Canadians. We know that inflationary deficits and taxes has resulted really in a wealth transfer. And so we're seeing the wealthiest of the wealthiest really have gotten ahead over the last, especially over the last few years. And, unless you have a considerable amount of assets, considerable amount of stocks, you haven't seen your wealth grow. And in fact, paychecks have reduced during this time for most Canadians. Even if they saw a moderate paycheck increase, it is not enough to offset the increases that we've seen. We've also seen numbers from Statistics Canada that the greatest cost increases have been on the essentials. So the biggest cost increases have been on housing, they've been on food, and they've been on fuel. And so, you know, when you look at where the big cost increases are that are affecting people, that are affecting small businesses, it's actually been on those essentials. And to continue on talking about the just where Canadians' incomes are and how the costs have been affected. In 2014, the year before this current government took office, the New York Times wrote that Canada was home to, quote, the world's most affluent middle class. So this is what I was just mentioning. Now the per capita economic output in most of our regions across the country lags behind those in the United States. And the state of Canada's economy was confirmed again by the Fraser Institute, who reported that Canadians' incomes have drastically fallen behind the incomes of Americans. And that Fraser Institute research shows that, quote, Canadian provinces are getting poorer relative to U.S. peers. And so when you're looking at some of these comparisons, everything, it's more difficult for people here in Canada. We are falling further behind. And as I mentioned, this RBC report does predict that Canada's GDP per capita will continue to decrease. And again, when we're comparing to other countries, this is a made in Canada issue. The other thing too that we've seen at this committee is just how people are struggling that have disabilities. We've had a fair amount of testimony here. We've just almost completed a disability study that I was mentioning earlier, and we know that that persons with disabilities are disproportionately affected by the cost of living crisis. We've heard some testimony from their family members. I know that myself, being the shadow ministry, my shadow ministry including disability inclusion, I do talk to families, organizations all the time that talk about how persons with disabilities are affected, and this does really also affect many of their families, because some, depending on the situation, sometimes the families are the primary caregivers, and they're having to assist their family member or look after their family member. And so the cost of living crisis really has hurt persons with disabilities disproportionately. I know that when we were debating the Canada Disability Benefit, we heard about this quite often. We even heard testimony regarding persons with disabilities considering MAID because they couldn't afford to live. That is incredibly heartbreaking and incredibly sad that someone would be considering that. We know that that many Canadians are feeling quite hopeless when they're looking at being able to just afford basic necessities. And in spite of all of this, the government continues on with their trajectory of their policies, of their high tax, high spend agenda. We haven't seen any indication of reprieval of this. We know that any time that this government puts out a fall economic statement or a budget, it does still include deficits. We know that there are reports where, in fact, the deficits are higher than what was expected by the government, and so that just shows how people aren't. That just shows how this government isn't able to manage their fiscal house. When every time we have a budget come out, that that it continues to be into deficit, and we have to remember that back when this government got elected back in 2015, how they had talked about, well, we're just going to have a little deficit. We're going to do some investing in Canadians. That was the sales, and we're going to.
That's great. We have a point of order.
You said the subject that the subject is what the member talks about. So there's been several subjects. So maybe you can ask the member what subject she's actually discussing at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Coteau. It is the member's discretion. I didn't call it a point of order. You have a point of order?
Just in response to what Mr. Coteau has said, because this has been brought up several times. We were supposed to be
That's not a point of order.
in camera, and
thank you.
Mr. Long
Point of
moved a
order,
motion
Mr.
to
Thank
put
you,
us
Ms.
in public, which
Ms.
gave us no
Falk.
Not a
agenda.
point
It gave
of
us no
order.
agenda whatsoever, so we don't actually
Ms.
have a
Falk,
specific
that is
topic
order.
that we are supposed to be
Ms.
chatting
Falk,
about today.
That's not a point of order. Ms. Gray, but you did give her a pause. Ms. Gray?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this just shows how the members of this government doesn't want to talk about what's important to people. How there was a promise made in the 2015 election to in order to have a very small deficit, as I was saying, and that was blown out of the water. This government was already going into deficit before the COVID pandemic hit, and so they were already going into deficit at a time when the economy was considerably stronger back in 2015, and then of course through their deficit spending, they really blew through that. We also know through an Auditor General's report that we had seen where many of the spending that this government did during the pandemic wasn't in alignment with the mandates that existed, and so they continued on with this spending. They've continued on with this high spending, and so here we are now where the national debt is the highest that it's ever been. We know that the debt servicing payments are going to be higher than they ever have been, and so instead of investing back into Canadians, investing into really important initiatives, whether they be border security or environmental or investing in Canadians, it's now going to go towards servicing debt. And one of the numbers that we had seen is the annual debt servicing will be very close to the amount of GST that is brought in every year. And so, basically it nulls most of what is coming in GST. Another number that we've seen is that it's more than we spend on the military. And so it's really concerning with the debts, with the debt servicing that costs that this government has to pay because of all of the spending that they've done. And we know that when we look at the government spending, there is so much wasteful spending. I mean, you can only look at, for example, giving fridges to Loblaws. I remember when the government did that. I was getting a call from a local small business in my community that was a florist. Saying, well, I need a new fridge, for my flower. Can I get a new fridge as well? Or a local grocer. I had a small independent grocer call and say, can I get new fridges as well? Well, no, it only went to, this very large, one of the largest, most, very profitable company in Canada, Loblaws. We know that the government gave $50 million to MasterCard. Oh, yeah. MasterCard of all organizations. So, who make huge interest payments off of Canadians, and yet they gave them $50 million. Of course, there's ArriveCan. We've got the SDTC, which now we have seen, which is why we're debating in the House of Commons, actually, with the money that has rolled through that. We know that the Auditor General did an audit of that and found that there was 186 instances of conflicts of interest. absolutely shocking amounts of dollars that flew through that organization, where board members were the recipients, board members or executives of organizations were recipients of money coming from the government to their own organizations. I mean, it was absolutely mind-blowing. And so, when we look at government spending, these are the kind of things that we're talking about. On that as well with the SDTC, there was a board member that was terminated who had talked poorly about the government, and so the Liberal minister of the day appointed someone else. And it came out later that it was known that person was in conflict because that person's company was receiving money, and yet the minister still decided to appoint that person, and then appoint different board members as well. You can't say that SDTC was at arm's length because there were senior officials in the minister's department that were sitting in on board meetings. So they were privy to the discussions and the decisions that were happening at that board meeting. And it was only because of a whistleblower that had come forward to bring this forth that went directly to, we had heard that brought it forth, nothing happened, and then went directly forth to the Auditor General, who then did this audit, and then this is what has all been brought forth. And of course, this is what we're debating in Parliament right now, because the government won't release all of the unredacted documents directly to the RCMP, and so Parliament is seized with this right now. But here's another example of such a lack of oversight from this government and government spending. We know that, for example, we've got the benefits delivery modernization that we did question the minister on the last time that he was here, which is upgrading a lot of the different programs that deliver services to Canadians, and that has blown through the original budget. We're talking billions of dollars that was disclosed the last time that minister was here. And again, we know that this minister will be coming again, but we'll only have the minister here for an hour. And when you're talking spending of billions and billions of dollars, we need the time in order to ask the minister the really tough questions. This is a huge budget that this minister is responsible for, and we really need to be asking the tough questions. Also, when we're talking about home building and costs. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier was the fact that Canada does not have a softwood lumber agreement. And, the softwood lumber agreement expired back in 2015. And during 3 different administrations, this government has not been able to negotiate a softwood lumber agreement. The former Conservative government did have a softwood lumber agreement. They negotiated a renewal or an extension, and then it expired in 2015. And so that has not been a priority of this government. What does flow through this committee is employment and workforce development. And as part of that, there have been thousands of forestry jobs that have been lost in Canada, in particular in British Columbia and my home province. Many mills that have closed, and we know that there's not a lack in North America of what they're producing. It's just that the business has been lost to the United States. And so, here without us having a softwood lumber agreement, the U.S. continues to add tariffs, And because our supply chains are so integrated, it just makes the cost go up here in Canada. People might say, well, why is that important? Well, because our supply chains are integrated, and when things are going back and forth, it means that costs are higher. And this is one of the things that does add to costs of home building. When you have lumber that is more expensive, that has not been a priority of this government. I remember one time we were asking the minister, even when she was having meetings set up with her counterparts in the United States, and the minister, shockingly, the trade minister, couldn't even answer those questions when she was having meetings, when formal negotiations were taking place. And that was a few years ago when I was involved in that portfolio, and still to this date, nothing has happened. And also recently, there have been tariffs that have been added on again. So, this just shows a real lack of these ministers and this government really having eyes on their departments and really oversight in their departments, the governance, the management of those departments, and being able to ask the tough questions and be able to move things forward that are in the best interest of Canadians. One of the other things that we can look at as well is when we're looking at crime. And we're looking at how much crime has gone up in this country. I know that when I'm home and I'm in my community, without even looking at the national statistics, it's one of the things that I hear about the most is cost of living and crime. And regardless of whether this is in someone's home or whether it's in their small business, I was meeting with a small business owner recently who they just recently had to invest in $20,000 and they're a small business. They had to invest $20,000 in various security measures because of all of the damage and break-ins that they were having. That's not unusual. I hear from residents all the time. That was one small business. I was meeting with another small business, which is a doctor's office with a specialized care, and that doctor's office, the same thing. They've had so much damage around their building, and they're continually having to call law enforcement. And it makes it really, really tough, to the point that their patients sometimes don't, are scared to come close to the building. And this is an office that's been there for 30 years, and it's really been only the last, she was saying about 4 or 5 years, in particular about the last 3 years, that it has become far worse. And so, this is where, this is where it's affecting people's houses, but also their small businesses as well. And for her, she also had to incur extra costs. And she said, someone said to her, well, why don't you just move? She said, well, I've been here 30 years. And where her office is, it's very close to a number of seniors' homes, and they're able to walk over. So it would be a real disservice for her if she had to move. And this is part of this government's soft on crime approach, that has really made things a lot more difficult for businesses. Mm-hmm.
Chair, point of order.
Sorry.
Mr. Fragascatos, you on a point of order?
I recognize very well, Mr. Chair, that it's not in keeping with the rules that I move anything on a point of order. However, I will offer this to the Conservative side, and in particular Ms. Gray, who has been forced to speak for 2 hours at the direction of her leader's office to protect Michelle Ferrari, who just a few days ago made the outlandish comment.
Point of order,
that the poor are naturally bound to commit crimes.
Point of
For
order,
2
Chair.
hours, they
Point of
forced
order.
us to filibuster.
This is not a point of
They want to
order.
adjourn the
Mr.
meeting. If they want
Fragiskatos
to
is
adjourn the meeting,
engaging
we
in
will-
hyperbole in an attempt to
mansplaining.
hijack this committee.
Thank you. Since you're all over speaking one another, I will return to Ms. Gray.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, this committee generally has, generally does have agendas, and this committee has been quite good at having agendas at particular meetings, we did have an agenda for this meeting. However, that agenda was taken away by other committee members. So here we are. And the work of this committee has been pushed ahead, not because of anything that the Conservatives have done today. It's been by other members of this committee that has now delayed the work of this committee. So going back again to talking about how people are affected both by cost of living and by crime, and whether it's small businesses. We know that small business is the backbone of this country. Many of us have small businesses in our communities. I know for myself, I do have some larger businesses and medium sized, but the vast majority are small businesses, which also include farmers. Small farmers are businesses, and many of the orchardists and viticulturalists that are in my area are small businesses, and they have seen the increase in the increase in their costs absolutely go up. In particular with transportation, with the transportation costs. But I'll go back to what I was just talking about, which is the aspect of crime, because as I said, this is something that I hear the most about from my residents. I do a lot of different surveys that go out, and I have thousands of people fill out surveys. And the two biggest issues that people do respond back on have to do with various aspects of cost of living and also crime, because it is affecting many people. And actually, I will mention as well, just on the point of crime, but also with helping people that have addiction, that are suffering from addiction. I will mention that. I did have a private members bill, which was called End the Revolving Door Act. And it was to, when you look at addiction and recovery, there's a lot that is provincial with healthcare related. But there is a federal element that we did come across. There are some, but one of them has to do with federal penitentiaries. So this would have, my private members bill would have had, for people that were incarcerated federally, the judge could offer the person, if they were if they had addiction, were suffering from addiction, and 70% of people that are incarcerated federally do suffer from addiction, that they could be offered to have a mental health assessment and then addiction treatment and recovery while they're in the federal penitentiary. And we did, this has happened in other jurisdictions. One of the biggest supporters was actually someone from the United States, that where this has happened in other areas, and there has really been a lot of success, because what happens is people go to the federal penitentiary and they don't deal with their addiction issues, and they come out and then they reoffend, and so they're caught in a really bad cycle. And while they're there for however many years, we could actually offer them treatment and recovery. Now, unfortunately, my private members bill wasn't supported by all members in this House, and it did not pass at second reading. But I think it's a real miss. And anytime that I talk about this with related to crime, I do hear huge support from people saying, geez, I wish that would have passed. It's not going to solve everything, but it definitely would have helped some people that were going through addiction issues.
I I believe if you were to seek it, there would be unanimous consent to adjourn the meeting.
Unanimous consent? You only miss, you cannot move a motion on a point of order. Ms. Gray could.
Okay.
Ms. Gray, if you don't quickly
Thank
get
you.
the floor, I'll
Thank
move
you,
it
thank
to the
you,
next
thank you.
speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we have 5 more minutes here before the meeting would be adjourned. So I'll just continue on with the. Yes, and just going back to the point of crime, we've seen Stats Canada data that shows, violent crime has increased by 50%, homicides are up 28%, sexual assaults are up 75%, and gang murders have nearly doubled. And when I'm back in my community and when I'm talking to small business owners, as I mentioned, this is a huge issue. We know that auto theft is up 46%. Actually, we know the Justice Minister's own car has been stolen 3 times. Extortion is up 357%. I mean, that is unbelievable. And this is really happening because the government has made things easier for gangsters and extortionists, really to get out of jail and reoffend a lot easier. We know that there have been a number of people that have gotten out of bail. Almost, unfortunately, we continually see headlines where there are people that are out on bail, and they're reoffending and creating really serious issues in communities and committing really serious crimes. We see it continually, and it's across the country. And a lot of it does have to do with 2 pieces of legislation that were changed by the government. One which amended the bail system, and another one which removed minimum sentences from many various serious crimes. For example, gun smuggling and drug trafficking, and even car thefts. Yes, and we've seen human trafficking numbers increase as well. Those numbers just came out over the last, I believe, over the last week or so, and so we see a lot of these increases in crime happening in many different categories, and it's affecting people's lives. And it is a result of policies and legislation, from this current government. Once a government has been in government for a while, you see the results of their policies and legislation play out. It's now been 9 years of this current government, and you can see the results of their various policies and legislation, whether it has to do on the economic side, or whether we're talking about the social side, the criminal justice side, and crime. And so we're seeing the results of their various policies and legislation. We know that there have been increases in random attacks of violence, like very serious attacks that have affected families, in broad daylight. And, we've seen this in particular in British Columbia play out quite a bit. And of course, it's made it worse because of the drug decriminalization that this federal government approved of by request of the NDP provincial government. And, shortly afterwards, right after they approved of that, we started seeing open drug use in parks and playgrounds. I started talking about it. Many of my colleagues started talking about it. And I remember one of the first times I asked about it in the House of Commons, I got shut down. Many times I had to ask my question 3 times because people were outraged. Well, guess what? It was only 9 months later that then the provincial government had asked to amend that policy, and the federal government finally did after a lot of pressure. And so, this is what we've seen, Mr. Chair, over the last while play out. And we're at 1 o'clock. So I believe we're adjourning at 1 o'clock, Mr. Chair. I believe we can adjourn. It's 1 o'clock, and I'm sure we all have other commitments. We'll move to adjourn. It's 1 o'clock. We all have other commitments.
Did
Yeah.
you move to
I
adjourn?
move to adjourn.
Is
The
it
meeting
the
is
will
over.
of the committee to adjourn? Do you want me
I
to
was
put
just
it to a
getting
vote?
I was just getting started.
The meeting is adjourned.